miracles, love for my fellow man, living in harmony here in New Orleans.
Your Lordships, the Honorable Justice Patrick Thompson and Ian Morley, the Honorable Iselin Phillip, Honorable Latoya Jones, other members of the National Assembly, other members of the Nevis Island Administration Cabinet, members of the opposition in Nevis Island Assembly, President of the Nevis Evangelical Association, Chair of the Nevis Christian Council, Permanent Secretary, Mr. Wakely Daniel, and other permanent secretaries, Director, heads of departments, other senior officials, principals, senior civil servants, and other government representatives, Superintendent Alonzo Carty, and members of the Royal St. Christopher and Nevis Police Force. Guests, a pleasant good morning. I am Eartha Carey, coordinator of the Citizens Security Secretariat. It is with great enthusiasm and a deep sense of responsibility that we welcome you all to this important consultation as we come together to discuss and introduce the plans to further address crime and violence from a public health perspective. Approaching crime from a public health perspective includes treating crime as a symptom of underlying societal issues and employing strategies like those used in public health to prevent and address it. Together, we will address the root cause of crime and work towards creating a safer and healthier environment for all citizens and residents. Effective mechanisms will consist of conducting comprehensive assessments of crime patterns, target interventions to identify high-risk population and areas prone to crime through data analysis, the launch of strategic preventative and public awareness campaigns to educate communities about the consequences of crime. Today's consultations mark the beginning of a collaborative journey leading up to the official launch, which we recently had on St. Kitts. This first initiative, themed 90 Days of Citizen Security, Whole of Society Responsibility, is not just a campaign but a call to action, a call for each of us to play our part in addressing the root causes of crime and violence in our communities. The tagline, government-led, society-driven, reflects our belief that while government leadership is crucial, the success of this campaign and beyond depends on the collective efforts of every segment of society. We are here today because we recognize that crime and violence are not just law enforcement issues. They are public health issues that affect the well-being of every citizen. By approaching these challenges from a public health perspective, we aim to create sustainable solutions that will continue to impact our communities positively long after this campaign and beyond ends. We look forward to your full engagement today, hearing your insights, your concerns, and your ideas as we continue to work together to lay foundations for a safer and healthier society. Your participation is vital, and we are confident that together we can achieve meaningful and lasting change. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being committed to this critical cause. At this time, please help me welcome Honorable Iselin Phillip.
Good morning to everyone. Please permit me to recognize from our presence the Honorable Premier Mark Brantley, members of the Nevis Island Administration, Honorable Eric Evelyn, Honorable Spencer Brand, of course members of the Federal Parliament, Honorable Latoya Jones, who's also a Deputy Speaker, Honorable Alexis Jeffers. I see, of course, member of the Nevis Island Administration Opposition, Honorable Janice Daniel Hodge, permanent secretaries, senior officials, government officials, members of the community, residents, friends, good morning to all of you. This morning, now we're here in Nevis following the launch of a series of national consultations and 90-day campaign that, as Ms. Carey mentioned, was launched in September last month. And this was done, as a stand against the proliferation of crime and violence in St. Kitts and Nevis. This initiative in relation to the national consultations and this 90-day campaign is being led by the government to engage and encourage an all-of-society approach to combating crime and violence at its root causes, which means we really seek to approach the problem of violence and crime from a public health perspective, where we find early intervention and prevention strategies that are based on data and findings, which will help to provide us with a lot more long-term solutions to help us reduce the spread of crime and violence in the long term. Now, the Honorable Prime Minister, Dr. Terence Drew, has described crime and violence as a disease that is being spread in our relationships, through our families, across our communities, and around our Caribbean region at a current rate that is explosive, scary, and alarming. When we really accept crime and violence as a disease that is plaguing us, a disease that threatens our safety and well-being as individuals and a collective, we are forced to consider strategies to stop the spread and heal ourselves. Like any other disease, if we want to contain and control it, we must change ourselves. We must shift our attitudes, change our behaviors, and relearn how to interact with each other. We must relearn how to be more respectful, to show kindness, empathy, care, and to exercise greater self-control. We must have the courage to work in partnership to condemn all forms of violence, not just gun crime and gang warfare that we see in our streets or hear about in the news. But we must also recognize the violence that is normalized and perpetuated in secret between spouses at home, towards children in families, among neighbors in our communities, and across our workplaces with co-workers. The solution to crime is complex. The problem is not new. The ideas and proposals are not novel. But this time around, the federal government, under the leadership of the Honorable Dr. Terence Drew, is committed to trying a change in approach in two significant ways. First, by defining the problem as a public health issue and taking the associated actions to contain, suppress, treat, and prevent the spread of violence and crime throughout society. Second, by taking the lead as the government to establish partnerships that enable all sectors of society to take a stance against violence and to cultivate healthier, happier, more peaceful, caring, and safe communities. The objective of the launched campaign and this 90-day period of intensity is really to help create a shared understanding of the causes of crime and violence at its root, and to help build capacity and encourage community leaders and non-governmental stakeholders to take action to cultivate healthy and safe communities. In the spirit of an all-of-society approach, we invite community-based partners to take the initiative to plan activities, host events that promote love, care, togetherness, and peaceful conflict resolution. Not only do we want everyone thinking and talking and being about peace and citizen security, but we also want to listen and hear back from you. Hence why we're having a series of consultations and community conversations. We want to hear back from community representatives with data and information and suggestions and proposals that will help to contribute to a national action plan with impactful and pragmatic activities that are proven to have positive short-term and long-term impact. Today's consultation here in Nevis will be marked by a number of presentations based on evidence-based approaches, local data findings, and lessons learned. We are privileged to have sharing with us some recognized professionals and experts to help paint a realistic picture of the problem and how it ought to be addressed for long-term change. Our first presentation will break down the concept of violence and crime as a public health issue so that we can all better understand the approach. Dr. Janita Richardson is an emerita professor of the University of Virginia, School of Medicine in the Department of Public Health Science. She currently lives and works in St. Kitts as a professor at Windsor University School of Medicine. Dr. Richardson has over 25 years of expertise in designing strategies to improve health equity outcomes, and she collaborated with the St. Kitts and Nevis Ministry of Health and other international health agencies to advance population health and well-being. You can look forward to hearing from Dr. Richardson, who has a recognized ability to take complex scientific concepts and data, like violence as a public health issue, and translate them into formats for easier and more relatable understanding. Our second presentation on the agenda will be delivered by an associate representative of USAID, Dr. Randy Seeprasad. He will join us virtually to report the findings of a recent criminal dynamics study done in St. Kitts and in Nevis. Dr. Randy Seeprasad is a criminologist and coordinator of the criminology unit at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. Dr. Seeprasad specializes in research methodology and statistics with special interest in economic deprivation and crime, gang violence, youth crime, justice, and penology. The research findings that Dr. Seeprasad will present is specific to St. Kitts and Nevis and the Caribbean region, so you can expect to be enlightened with data and evidence about the realities of gang crime and violence in our communities. Finally, it is really our hope that the data and information shared will be insightful and help to motivate all of us to partner in action in order to build a safer St. Kitts and Nevis. So please sit back, relax, and open your mind and embrace this opportunity to learn and be inspired as co-creators of solutions to the root causes of violence and crime in St. Kitts and Nevis. Thank you for your continued attention, and we look forward to the interaction and engagement on the topics presented after the session so that we can begin to collect information and data and inspire everyone to take the lead as part of an all-of-society approach to combating the issue of crime and violence in St. Kitts and Nevis. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for that. At this time, please help me welcome Dr. Richardson to deliver her presentation.
Good morning. We'll wait for the presentation to pop up. Please allow me to acknowledge the introductions that already have been mentioned. A special thank you to Premier Brantley and ministers and representatives from the Ministry of Health, with whom I've had the honor of working with for at least a dozen years. So what I'd like to share with you today, what I've been charged with, is helping connect the dots between violence and public health. And why are we even talking about those two things in the same sentence? It's really difficult for people who are outside of the discipline to understand, because we think about public health as vaccinations, managing COVID, and things like that. And so why does violence fit into that category? So violence is a scourge threatening every society. And we can no longer pretend that violence is someone else's problem. All of us are affected either directly or indirectly by violence. In the words of my colleague, Dr. Isbin Williams, violence takes many forms, which converge to erode the well-being of us all and stymies developmental efforts of individuals, communities, and entire economies. Your presence today alludes to the fact that you understand that to address this complex issue, we must do so collaboratively. But where does the problem of violence begin? And what evidence-based interventions are most effective in preventing violence in the first place? And why should we even consider violence a public health issue? To answer those questions, we'll go to the first slide, which suggests we begin at the beginning with our definition of health. So when we're talking about health, we need to think about the World Health definition, World Health Organization's definition of health, which is more than just the absence of disease, but rather a comprehensive strategies to optimize the well-being of populations. And so we do so with prevention strategies. And so when we're thinking about health, and I talk to my students about this as capital H health, we're talking about well-being that includes social and mental and emotional, environmental support that allows young ones like my grandson here to grow to be their optimal best selves. Public health is the science of preventing disease and injury at the community and population level through policies and interventions. Public health entities seek to promote health through organized preventative efforts, data-informed choices of societies, organizations, public and private communities, as well as individuals. In public health, we tell the story of the stream. Once upon a time, there were two public health workers on the banks of a stream, and they noticed babies floating down the river. One public health worker started grabbing the babies to save them from the river. The other public health person disappeared for a while. After some time, babies stopped floating down the river. When the two workers joined together, the first asked the second, "What happened to the babies? Why did they stop flowing?" And the public health person who had disappeared for a while said, "I went upstream to find out why the babies were in the river in the first place." By definition, public health seeks to collaborate across every societal sector and group to optimize comprehensive well-being of populations through prevention strategies. Targets for public health attention are driven by data that highlights prevalence, clustering, spread, transmission vectors of the issue of concern. Prevalence speaks to the number of cases of the focus in proportion to the total population being considered. But that's just the beginning. There must then be a determination of where the clusters of that issue reside and where are the greatest pockets of risk. Then we wonder how quickly is prevalence changing within a population, and then how is this issue transmitted from person to person? Some of the other questions that guide public health investigations are these. We think about how many people are affected and what are these risk factors? And then are there existing strategies to help prevent the issue that we see affecting our populations? Because as much as possible, we do not want to reinvent the wheel. That takes a lot of resources and time. But what we also know is that strategies that we borrow from other places have to be tailored to the culture and the place where we want to implement them. So if we think about the role of public health and our definition of health, then we can begin to see how population health is associated with our concerns around violence. By every measure, violence and crime pose a threat to the well-being of citizens. And we remember our definition of health as being promoting the comprehensive well-being of population, thus making violence a public health priority. Further, violence takes many forms, as previously noted, by obvious homicides and sexual violence and physical assaults and mortality, but also the trauma of verbal and emotional abuse, and then the vicarious violence experienced by witnesses and families. If there is good news about this subject, it is that education on life skills and conflict resolution at an early age have been proven to reduce violence. The Centers for Disease Control state that by understanding the types of violence, we can take action on them before they impact our communities. What we in public health acknowledge is that siloed approaches are ineffective because people do not live in silos. The environments in which our children grow up, the places where people work and live, the community norms about engagement and values, schools, neighborhood stores, where we place our health centers, and even social positioning act on individuals long before a trigger is pulled on a gun. So in the terminology then of public health, all of those factors that I was just talking about are social determinants of health. The focus on determinants of health are also our focus because the many spheres of influence act on individuals at the same time. So determinants of health speak to the environments in which people work and play and live. And all of these things are happening long before someone is presented as a risk to perpetuating or a victim of violence. So the focus on the determinants of health are also our focus because each sphere of influence has been proven effective in preventing other health problems, and violence should be viewed as a public health issue because it shares key characteristics for other diseases that benefit from a public health approach. Similar to diseases, violence has identifiable risk factors, including poverty, violence, exposure to violence, substance abuse, and mental health issues, just to name a few. These risk factors can be addressed through preventative measures. Addressing violence through a public health lens allows for the development of targeted prevention programs, such as community-based interventions, education campaigns, policies that address the root causes of violence, in addition to managing violence that currently exists. Viewing violence as a public health issue provides a comprehensive framework for understanding the causes, the consequences, and the solutions to the violence that we face. A public health approach encourages collaboration between healthcare providers, educators, law enforcement, community organizations to create comprehensive strategies to prevent violence. When I talked about spheres of influence, this is what I was referring to. You see, individuals have decision-making prowess of their own, but all individuals exist in relationship to other people, and those relationships influence behavior and choices. And then those individuals and relationships are nestled within communities. And communities have their own infrastructure and norms and values. And then every community is situated within a society which has policies and practices and laws that also influence individuals. And so all of these spheres of influence are acting on the person who we hope will never pull the trigger at the same time. So by treating violence as a public health issue, interventions can be designed that are based on evidence and research, ensuring also that your resources are dedicated to the most effective strategies, making your investment efficient and effective. There is evidence to support the notion that violence actually can be prevented. However, addressing this complex issue requires collaboration across every sector of society, remembering that individuals do not live in silos. There is no good data that suggests that the criminal justice system and law enforcement alone can reduce the rates of crime and violence. In fact, the opposite is true. If the only approach, look at the United States, if the only approach is the criminal justice system and law enforcement, what we see, in fact, is an increase in crime and violence. In addition, uncoordinated efforts of well-meaning organizations and agencies have also proven ineffective. So a commitment to violence prevention is really more of a marathon than a sprint, and requires long-term strategies being employed at the same time as short-term interventions are being constructed. Since the strongest predictor of violence is violence, and that violence is often retaliatory and contextualized, there is a cycle that we need to break. Social norms about proper response to confrontations, for example, is one way to start, even in elementary school. The violent act is a manifestation that has very complex roots. Those seemingly indirect influences are the social determinants of hell. I'm a professor and a mother and a grandmother, and I am reminded on a regular basis how dangerous it is to even send my grandchildren to school in the States. Violence affects all of us, even if we don't know someone personally. Just knowing that going down a particular street that tends to be dangerous creates a vicarious violent experience in each of us. As you deliberate today and in the days to come, please consider the world that we're creating for our children, for our elders, for ourselves, for the building of our economies. While all of us are vulnerable to the direct and indirect consequences of violence, not one of our agencies, ministries, companies can address this violence issue alone, which is why it makes sense for us to talk about it as a public health issue and work together across our silos to make that happen. Change for the better lies in active, strategic collaborations across society, and the way forward is collaboratively and together. Oh, I'm finished now. Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. The way forward is together. Now, you would have heard Dr. Richardson spoke about the social determinants. He had spoke about how we must work together to combat crime and violence. She spoke of collaboration, strategic long-term planning, and it all for me sums up to be, we just can't do it alone. It's a whole of society approach, therefore all hands on deck. So thank you for that, Dr. Richardson. Our next presentation will be done virtually, and it will be by a representative from the USAID, a report on criminal dynamics, a study of St. Kitts and Nevis.
I would like to adopt the introductory protocols that have already been observed. Today, I want to present to you some findings from a study which USAID conducted. It was a study on criminal gangs in 11 countries. St. Kitts and Nevis was one of the countries, and I present to you detailed findings on St. Kitts and Nevis, and I'm hoping that this information sheds some light that would help us or help to provide a deeper understanding of what is happening with gangs in St. Kitts and Nevis. As we've seen across the Caribbean region, criminal gangs represent one of the most significant threats to national security. And if this factor, if criminal gangs are not dealt with effectively, it really does not bode well. I start out by introducing the research team. I was privileged to lead a team of researchers, and I list here the primary researchers. In addition to myself, you would see Dr. Charles Katz and Dr. Kayla Freeman from Arizona State University. The entire team was supported by the folks at LAC-LEARN, with funding provided as well as technical support provided by USAID. In conducting this study, the aim was to collect primary data as well as to gather and utilize secondary data which existed, but there was a benchmark in terms of the data that we used. And our benchmark was that the data must be high quality, it must be nationally representative, and it must be of the quality that it could be used in peer-reviewed journals. So we were very selective and meticulous in terms of the kinds of data that we utilize in this particular study. You would see some of the primary data listed here. For example, we collected or conducted what is called police expert surveys, where we visited persons who were gang experts in each of the police station districts in St. Kitts and Nevis and collected detailed information on each and every criminal gang that existed. We collected a wide range of information, and in collating this information, it allowed us to gain some very deep insights into what was happening with St. Kitts gangs in St. Kitts and Nevis. And I will share some of those findings. We also collected homicide data and other crime data to get a very detailed understanding of the links between gangs and crime, where the crime was happening, which gangs were committing the crimes, etc. And we will share some of those findings as well. In addition to that, we collected data from Form 4 and 5 students in public secondary schools in St. Kitts and Nevis with a 57% response rate, meaning that we surveyed 57% of all enrolled Form 4 and 5 students in St. Kitts and Nevis public secondary schools. 57% is very, very high by survey research standards. In addition to that, we collected other data sets, and I mentioned here, for example, the Latin American Public Opinion Project 2016 data set, which is a nationally representative data set, which contains important information for understanding crime and security issues in St. Kitts and Nevis, and which incidentally also allows for comparison to other countries across the Caribbean region, simply because the same instrument and the same methodology is applied across different Caribbean countries, and therefore it allows for comparisons across the region. We go now into some of the findings. We look here at homicides in St. Kitts and Nevis from 2000 to 2002. These are numbers that some of you will be familiar with. You do see a fluctuating pattern in homicides, and what is quite interesting is that the number of gun-related homicides very, very closely matches the total number of homicides. What it tells you is that the vast majority of homicides in St. Kitts and Nevis are actually committed with firearms. And firearms, as you will know, tend to be much more lethal when used as opposed to other types of weapons. You will have, in comparison, other countries in the Caribbean where the rate of firearm homicides is much lower, or the percentage of homicides committed by firearms is much lower. And what you will find in these countries that even though violent crimes will happen, the lethality of those crimes tends to be much lower, simply because your chances of survival is much higher if you become a victim of a crime where a firearm is not involved. But when a firearm is involved, there is a much greater likelihood that victims would actually be killed. What it does suggest is that one of the ways of dealing with violent crime in St. Kitts and Nevis has to do with effectively interdicting and taking firearms off of the streets or stopping the flow of firearms into St. Kitts and Nevis in the first place. This particular chart shows data from the Latin American Public Opinion Project or LAPOP surveys, where residents were asked to state whether youth gangs were a problem in their neighborhood. And this particular chart shows the percent of persons who indicated that youth gangs were a very serious or somewhat serious problem in their neighborhoods. You would see that St. Kitts and Nevis comes out at the top. Now, you may say to yourself, of course, that countries like Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, and the Bahamas definitely do have a much larger number of gangs than St. Kitts and Nevis. That is absolutely true. But at the same time, public perceptions of the gang problem is also something that is very, very important, because it is one way of assessing the extent of criminal gangs and the perception of criminal gangs in the country. And while St. Kitts and Nevis is indeed a smaller country compared to some of the other Caribbean countries, and indeed does have a lower number of criminal gangs, the perception is there that criminal gangs really do represent a very serious problem. And you see in yellow to the top right, in St. Kitts, when we disaggregate the findings for St. Kitts, we find that nearly 30% of residents in St. Kitts, compared to 9.5% in Nevis, believe that youth gangs are a very serious or somewhat serious problem in their neighborhoods. This particular data derives from the police gang experts. You'll recall that I mentioned that we went to every single police station district in St. Kitts and Nevis and collected detailed information on each and every gang. We found out when we collated that information that there were 15 gangs in St. Kitts and Nevis, and this data is current as of December 2023. The numbers may have changed slightly by now, but as of that time, 15 gangs and approximately 323 gang members, with an average of about 20 persons per gang. Here we see the distribution of gangs based on different locations in St. Kitts and Nevis. And the locations which really stand out here would be Basseterre and Keon. In the case of Basseterre, you would see 33.3% or 1/3 of all gangs, and nearly 70% of all gang members in the Basseterre area. Other data that we've uncovered in this particular study again points to the Basseterre area as one of the core areas of intervention. And my colleague, Dr. Richardson, would have talked about the public health approach to crime prevention. And one of the concepts that she would have alluded to was the issue of secondary prevention. And the idea behind that is that in doing secondary prevention interventions, you're focusing on areas and persons who are most at risk of involvement in the target behavior. In our case, we are concerned about violence, crime and violence. So in the case of Basseterre, what this suggests is that this would be a very, very good location for secondary interventions, simply because there is a greater likelihood in that particular location of finding persons who are engaged in gangs, persons who are at high risk of becoming involved in gangs, even if they're not current gang members, and persons who are highly likely to be engaged in gang violence. This particular graph just gives you a spatial representation, a map of St. Kitts and Nevis. Again, you see the Basseterre area standing out. In the case of Nevis, the data that we had as of December 2023 indicated that there were 2 gangs and approximately 17 gang members. Now, I don't know whether this will sound to you as a small number or a large number, but you do need to take this in the context of the size of Nevis. While St. Kitts and Nevis, as I mentioned, may be small population-wise and size-wise compared to other countries, when you take the size and the population of St. Kitts and Nevis into account, in the context of the number of gangs and the gang members, what you would actually find is that the number of gangs and gang members is relatively large for the size of St. Kitts and Nevis. So it's not surprising that larger countries like Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica would have a larger number of gangs, but part of that has to do with the simple size of the country. So we do need to take size into account. And one of the things that we will see later on is that even school youths are becoming attracted to gangs. And information across the Caribbean will suggest that we have in some countries youths as young as 8 and 9 years of age saying that they are affiliated with gangs, saying that they want to join a gang. And this is something that is very, very troubling, because what you find happening is that some of the traditional role models, whether it's parental figures or religious figures, etc., are being replaced by gang members and gang leaders. And while in the case of Nevis, you may see a very small number of gangs and gang members, there is the danger that these persons can serve as role models to the youths. And just like a health problem, a physical health problem, gang violence and the whole idea of gang membership can spread like a disease, as Dr. Richardson had pointed out in the previous presentation. This particular chart gives you data on the organizational attributes of gangs, and we collated this data from the police expert data on all gangs in St. Kitts and Nevis, and we do see that the vast majority of them do have an area, or what is sometimes called a turf, that they consider to be their own, and quite often they protect this turf. You would see the majority of them, 60%, do actually defend this area. And this is one of the things that sometimes leads to intergang rivalries. You see that doing illegal things is acceptable by roughly half of the gangs, and you see other organizational attributes of gangs indicated in this particular chart. And this derives from an examination of data from all gangs in St. Kitts and Nevis as of December 2023. This particular chart shifts to looking at students' engagement. You would recall in gangs, you would recall that at the outset I indicated that we surveyed Form 4 and 5 students in public secondary schools in St. Kitts and Nevis. And you would see that we have self-report gang membership, we have what is called a Eurogang member, and we also have the proportion of youths who are former gang members, and the proportion hovers somewhere between 6 and 7%. The reason that we used different definitions of gangs, for instance, self-report gang membership versus a Eurogang membership measure, is that we wanted to triangulate the findings using different definitions. So in the case of self-report gang membership, we asked youths to simply indicate whether they were a member of a gang and whether they were a member of a former gang. The Eurogang measure is slightly different in that it doesn't actually use the word gang, but it still measures whether a person is a gang, and it actually does so by asking a series of questions which really get at the characteristics of the gang. So we ask, for instance, whether youths are in a group, whether the group accepts illegal activity, whether the group engages in illegal activity together, whether the group has some kind of identity, whether there's an area or turf that they call their own, etc., etc. And once persons answer yes to a series of questions, really what they're doing is ticking off the characteristics of a gang without actually using the word gang, because different words may be used to indicate the concept of a gang. So this is a way of measuring gangs, which has been internationally accepted. And you would see that the estimates provided by the Eurogang measure is actually very, very close to the estimate provided by the self-report measure. So it really lends confidence to the measures that we have derived. This particular chart shows information from school youths, and it indicates two things: reasons that youths give for joining gangs and the initiation requirements. And you would see that many youths join gangs for protection, for company, to make friends. And we do need to be mindful of these things, because if we understand the reasons that they join, and reasons, may I say, are different from risk factors, and Dr. Richardson spoke about the idea of risk factors, and we will come to talk about that. But if we understand the reasons that they join, then in the design of interventions, we can cater to these reasons. So for instance, if youths join gangs for protection, it means that they feel unsafe for some reason, they feel that there is a chance that they will be victimized, and so forth. And we need to examine why this is happening and put measures in place to ensure that youths feel protected. And a very good parallel that we quite often see is within the prison setting, that you have new prisoners who will come in to the prison setting, and it's a very dangerous, typically a very dangerous environment where new inmates will feel the need for protection. And quite often the gang might be the one thing that might offer protection, because if you are a member of a gang, people wouldn't interfere with you because you're now under the protection of the gang. And you would find that when people enter the prison, they may not necessarily have belonged to a gang, but they may end up becoming a gang member when they enter the prison, simply for the need of protection or because they require resources, etc. So it's definitely important to understand why youths in St. Kitts and Nevis actually join gangs. When we come to the design of interventions, to the right we see the initiation requirements, and you would see indeed that a large proportion of youths actually had to do nothing. They could just join the gangs just like that. Some of them had to commit a crime. A few even said that they had to kill someone or fight or shoot someone, etc. And it's quite often the case that many gangs will indeed, when you look at the international literature, require some kind of initiation requirement before somebody is actually able to join the gang. Now, this particular chart looks at risk factors for gang affiliation. This is something that's really important. It's one thing to say that various factors may affect gang violence or may affect gang membership and so forth. And the public health model that Dr. Richardson really nicely constructed indicated that persons are situated within nested, overlapping contexts. So we have contexts that may be very close to us, like the family or the school or the community, and then we have wider contexts like the society or even the international context. And of course, you have the individual with their own propensities, their own level of self-control, their own personality, etc. And it's a very complex interplay of factors at successively different levels of analysis or different environments which affect the person. So the public health approach that Dr. Richardson shared with us really gives us a menu of choices from which we can look to determine what are the factors that may affect a particular behavior. In this case, we are concerned with gang affiliation. And what we do as researchers, and indeed exactly what we did here in this study, is we used a model like that and we pull out a whole range of factors from within each of the levels of analysis. So there were a lot of variables about the school environment, the community, the peer group, the family, etc. And we collected this data and we analyzed this data to find out what was some of the core factors that were empirically related to gang affiliation. Now, it's important to note that while the model itself, the public health model itself, may provide a range of choices, many of them theoretically driven, many of them based on research, we have to verify which particular factors among the very large range of factors are actually empirically related in different places. So you may go to one country and find that certain factors are important predictors for gang affiliation and gang violence, and in another country you may find that other factors are important. And I'm sharing with you here only a subset of the findings for St. Kitts and Nevis. One of the things that really popped out at us in St. Kitts and Nevis, and I would dare say in many of the other countries that we looked at, was the issue of trauma and neglect and abuse, basically what we would call adverse childhood experiences which occurred within the family. Very, very strong predictor, and certainly something that is extremely consistent with international research. What it does suggest to us that among the other findings that we found, and I'm only highlighting a subset of the findings here as I mentioned, but what it does suggest is that any intervention that you want to design to deal with gang affiliation and violence in St. Kitts and Nevis has to take a very careful look at what is happening in the family, with a view to remedying factors within the family that may put youths at risk of joining gangs, put youths at risk of engaging in crime and violence. So when they experience physical neglect, emotional abuse in the family, they may not actually feel protected. They may not feel that they have the social support and the love that they need. and they may gravitate to other groups of youths who may be perceived to provide that. And some people see gangs as their families, and gangs indeed do provide that kind of support. So we need to provide a way to ensure that families take that kind of control and provide that support, as opposed to having youths gravitate towards gangs, which really leads them down a very dangerous path. This particular chart shows the engagement of gang members and non-gang members in different kinds of activities. And we're interested really here in the commission of property offenses, violent offenses, and substance abuse. And the delinquency variety score at the bottom really has to do with the range of delinquent activities that persons engage in. And not surprisingly at all, we found that gang members, whether identified through self-report or through the Eurogang membership measure, were much more highly engaged in crime and substance abuse than persons who were not in a gang. And this is not a surprise. You would see this in every country in the Caribbean and certainly in the international research. But it is empirical evidence that gangs do encourage youths to engage in criminal offending. Here, we compare what you might term the adult gangs to the youth gangs, meaning we collected data on the characteristics of gangs from the police, and the police were focused on the adult gangs in St. Kitts and Nevis, and we compared them to the characteristics of the youth gangs from the youth data that we collected in the schools. This is just a subset of the data. You would know that there is indeed a report, a full report, which has much more depth to the data, and I believe you would already have a copy of that report. So we saw in the adult gangs that all of them were made up of members of African descent, whereas when we looked at the youths, we saw much more ethnic diversity in the gangs. Same thing with gender, almost all male or exclusively male when we looked at the adult gangs, but we see much more gender equity when you're looking at the younger gangs. And this is something we have seen across the Caribbean region as well. In St. Kitts and Nevis, we saw in the adult gangs that only 6% of the gang members had foreign-born members, whereas when it comes to the youth gangs, a much larger proportion of the youth gangs actually had foreign-born members. And of course, the age demographic was different, not surprisingly, with the adult gangs having older gang members when compared to the youth gangs. This particular chart shows you gang and non-gang homicides. So we're getting a little bit into the analysis of the crime data now to give you an idea of what is happening. And what we are interested in is the percentage of homicides that are gang-related homicides. And you see when you look at this chart that they're actually concentrated, nearly 60% of the gang-related homicides that we have examined, and we looked at over a 10-year period of data, occurred within the Basseterre region. Again, it's telling you that you really need to keep a very close eye on the Basseterre region, and intervention efforts need to be focused very heavily on that particular area. As you will see in the last slide, not just intervention, and of course coming from the public health approach, but also the suppressive side. You do need to balance it. So you do need to utilize the police and the court system and all of that, but you also do need to rely very heavily on the preventative side. Here, we look at some of the characteristics of gang and non-gang homicides. When compared to non-gang homicides, you would notice that the victims of gang homicides are almost exclusively male. So in this case, we see that 98% of the victims of gang homicides are male when compared to 81% of male victims in non-gang homicides. This is something that we see across the region, but at the same time, one of the things we're starting to see in some countries, Trinidad and Tobago being one of them, is that females are becoming more and more involved in gangs. And we are also seeing that females are starting to be killed in increasing numbers as a result of gang violence. Now, in the case of St. Kitts and Nevis, you would have noticed that there's a lot more gender equity when it comes to the youths who said they were affiliated with gangs or they were gang members. What it does suggest is that if these youths get older and they continue to be engaged in the gangs, in the future, you're going to see more gender equity within the adult gangs. And one of the consequences of this is you might start to see females also being killed within the context of gang violence. You also notice that the average age of persons who are victims of gang homicides is actually younger, about 10 years younger than the average age of victims of non-gang homicides. This is something we see again across the Caribbean region and in the international literature. And exclusively when you have gang homicides, they're committed with firearms. Whereas in comparison, when we look at non-gang homicides, a smaller percentage, about 62% of them committed with firearms. But it does tell you that gang members do have firearms and they are willing to use the firearms. Again, points you to the issue of dealing with firearms as one of the components of a crime strategy. And there are many, many different ways to deal with firearms, from, destroying stockpiled weapons to better surveillance of the coasts with things like radar and satellite imagery, even drones, etc., etc. This particular chart shows you a number of different things, but I want to focus really on one thing in this particular chart. And this is the distinction between expressive and instrumental homicides when it comes to gang-related homicides versus non-gang related homicides. And what do we mean by expressive versus instrumental? When we talk about a homicide that has been committed for some kind of instrumental reason, we are talking about typically a homicide that has been committed for monetary gain. So for instance, you go to rob somebody and you end up killing them. Really the intent was that you want to get some money or property or something from the person, but you ended up killing them. When we are talking about a homicide that is expressive, we are talking about something that is emotionally driven, emotive. So we are talking about some fight for turf or some issue of disrespect or some issue of protection. They're not engaging in the violence for money or to gain anything out of it tangible, any material gain, right? And what you see is that a much larger proportion of the gang-related homicides are expressive. It tells you some of the reasons that are driving gang-related homicides in St. Kitts and Nevis. It has to do with inter-gang rivalries, with the protection of turf and all of these kinds of things. And I think sometimes in designing interventions, we tend to forget the people. We tend to forget the people who are involved and the lives that they live and the impact that gang violence have on them and their mental health. We often neglect this, right? And I want to share with you an example. This is something that always stayed with me. Just to illustrate, I evaluated some years ago a program called the Nature Nurture program. It was a therapeutic kind of program providing psychological care and counseling to youths who had lost a parent due to gang violence. And I was interviewing this youth, he was 11 years old, who was a beneficiary of the program. And I asked this kid, what was the one thing that you wanted most in life? And you'd be surprised at what he told me. He told me that the one thing that he wanted most in life was to go to prison and kill the person who had killed his father, 11 years old. And sometimes, as I said, we neglect the person. Can you imagine the deep-seated psychological hate, the psychological trauma, the stress that has been going on in this youth's mind to drive him to that point? How do you undo that, right? So if you're going to design a gang intervention and you have people like that, do you think that just the provision of education or job opportunities or all of that might be enough to pull a person like that out of a gang when there are these deep-seated psychological issues. So we need to think about other things like cognitive behavioral therapy or other things that might really get at these deep-seated issues. And all of these things are really, consistent with a public health approach to dealing with crime and violence. Now, this particular chart here is based on our social network analysis of the gang homicides in St. Kitts and Nevis from 2010 to mid-2023. And what the thickness of the lines indicated, there were a lot of details in the actual detailed report. I'm not going to go into all of this, but I wanted to share these specific details with you here. The thickness of the line tells you is the proportion of gang-related homicides that have been happening in St. Kitts and Nevis. And what you realize is that the majority of intergang rivalry from this period, which is a very long period, has been happening between KMS and Tech Life. And you will notice also there's a fairly thick line between KMS 1 and 2. Some of you will know that the KMS gang had split into two factions which were at rivalries with each other. What it is really telling you is that while there are a number of gangs in St. Kitts and Nevis, that you need to focus your energies in terms of an intervention on KMS and Tech Life and KMS 1 and 2. And I do understand from talking to law enforcement agencies in St. Kitts and Nevis that Tech Life also had split into two factions. And that is a dangerous thing. And we've seen that in other countries. And people who would sit together and be friends together like a family, sometimes when they split, you'd be surprised the same people turning around and killing each other because they are now rivals. This particular chart graphs for each gang in St. Kitts and Nevis the number of times, based on the crime data from 2010 to 2023, that the gang has been involved either as a victim and a suspect in gang-related homicides. And what you would realize is that KMS and Tech Life come out way at the top. You'll see the bloods there as well in that rectangle to the top right. So it means that these three gangs here are gangs that you really need to target. And KMS and Tech Life did come out in the previous slide. You would see another area circled a little lower down, KMS 1 and KMS 2. They are also runner-ups, if you want to call it that, right? So what it does suggest is that your interventions do need to focus on the KMS 1 and 2, on Tech Life and on the Bloods in terms of getting the gang violence situation under control. If you're dealing with secondary or tertiary prevention initiatives, these are one of the places that you really need to focus on very heavily. This particular chart shows you the spatial linkages between various gang-related murders. And what we realized is that every single gang-related murder that happened during this period that we were considering actually had a link through the St. George region, because we were able to actually map where the murders happened to find out, where they may have been initiated or originated, where they were committed, etc. So the St. George region appears to be a very central focal point as well for intervention purposes. I just, in this particular slide, share some information which I know you're already familiar with, to tell you what is currently happening in St. Kitts and Nevis, or what has happened in St. Kitts and Nevis with respect to gangs. And of course, that is something that you can definitely build on and perhaps use within a public health approach. In terms of summing up, and there is just one more slide after this, we know that there is a gang problem in St. Kitts and Nevis. The estimate that we have is 15 gangs and about 320 gang members. We do know that adverse childhood experiences represent a key risk factor for gang membership in St. Kitts and Nevis. Gangs, not surprisingly, are involved disproportionately in crimes. We note that a lot of the gang violence is expressive as opposed to instrumental. We also know that there's just a handful of gangs that are really involved in the bulk of gang-related homicides, and all of them are connected through the parish of St. George. So all of this information should really help you in the design of an intervention. And I really want to conclude, and I'm not going to go into this model in detail, but it really is an application of the public health approach And what it does suggest in this particular proposed model for gang intervention in St. Kitts and Nevis is that we really do need to look at the gang problem in a very comprehensive way. We do need to look at the successive environments, the successive system of nested environments within which persons who are in gangs and persons who have a risk of becoming gang members find themselves, and the risk factors that may drive those persons to join gangs and to engage in gang violence. I mentioned that we definitely do need to use risk differentiated approaches, meaning we need to target our resources at the persons most at risk. That's an efficient way to use resources. Target your findings to the persons most at risk, the gangs most at risk, and the places most at risk. So we can engage in secondary as well as tertiary prevention initiatives. You would notice to the bottom left that I do mention suppression here as well within the context of this model. So we cannot actually afford to neglect the law enforcement, the judicial, the intelligence side of all of this. We do need to have that machinery working very, very effectively as well, because that is an important part of the solution. This is my final slide, and in closing, I really do want to congratulate the government and the people of St. Kitts and Nevis on this brilliant, in my mind, brilliant initiative in really, from what I've seen across the Caribbean, taking the lead in using and considering the public health approach to crime and violence prevention. I really do hope that you're able to operationalize it and put it into effect in St. Kitts and Nevis. The international research will tell you that it is a robust type of approach, and it has met with a lot of success. We do need, and I really love Dr. Richardson, and I will steal your phrase. You gave that analogy of the babies floating down the river. That's the first time I heard that one, and I will have to use that, Dr. Richardson, in my classes. You have to do something to stem the flow, and that's what we don't do. We leave all the factors that drive the problem, and in the end, when the problem happens, the police is struggling, and the courts are struggling, and the prisons are overflowing, but we don't do anything to stop the flow of the violence. And this is what you're doing. So my warmest congratulations to the government and the people of St. Kitts and Nevis. I don't know if there are questions or if we go straight back to the chair. Thank you so very much, everyone, for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Sipasad. Any questions for him? No. Okay. So we all have listened, we have seen the importance of data. The main purpose of data collection is to gather relevant information for analysis and assist with decision making. In addition, generate insights, monitor progress, solve problems, and contribute to the existing body of knowledge. We have a situation on our hand which tells us that we have to tackle it, which is a task. What actions are we going to take? Because what we want is positive results. Please allow me to now welcome to the podium the Honorable Matt Brantley to share his remarks.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And protocols have been established, and so I need not take up time with that. I must confess that having listened to the various experts, that one may be driven to a stage of depression here in St. Kitts and Nevis. It seems sometimes, as we look at the scale and scope of the problem, that we almost conclude that it is beyond our capacity to solve. Thankfully, there are those of us who do not agree that it's beyond our capacity. And I'm grateful and would wish to publicly commend the Prime Minister for his approach in involving this all of society. I have said and consistently said that crime is a social problem. Crime is not a political party issue. It is not a government issue. And as I believe we've heard from the experts this morning, law enforcement cannot solve crime on its own. There is the ongoing sense that whenever a crime occurs, there's some who blame the government, blame the police, but they're not prepared to assist the government or to assist the police. I have made the observation that whenever crimes occur in major countries in the world, one of the first things that law enforcement does, they put it out on the media and they ask for the help of the population. It tells me that law enforcement, even in the most sophisticated countries in the world, rely heavily on the involvement of the public. We have a public that says it's not our problem. Let the police do their work. Let the Prime Minister do his work. And that, I think, is part and parcel of the difficulty that we have sometimes, because we can see sometimes things happening and we refuse to engage. I don't propose to be long because I'm not an expert, and I believe that the purpose of this consultation is exactly that, to consult. And so your views and opinions are what people are here to collect. I, however, find that in this discussion that we've had thus far this morning, there's a group of people whom I don't think have been mentioned, and perhaps as we drill down, we will get into that group of people, but I call them the enablers. You see, it is one thing to measure the gang members, those who self-report or those who, by ticking various boxes, you determine are gang members. But my sense is that there's a cohort of persons out there who provide the enabling environment, where the drugs and the guns and the being hidden. Some of them who might be doing the driving or doing the setting up. And sometimes we might be surprised as to who those individuals might be. They're not necessarily the ones sitting on the block with the sagging pants. They're not necessarily the ones smoking and behaving in any unruly fashion. But they are very much part and parcel of the problem. So I believe that any intervention program must also seek to identify those individuals and see how we can address in a fulsome way the involvement of this larger group of what I call the enablers. I'm sure the experts may have better language than me, but I'm using that term so that you could understand the point that I'm trying to make, that there are individuals involved. And I know this because as a politician, I engage with all sectors of my constituency and my community. And I sometimes wonder, well, where are individuals in the criminal class getting their data from? Where are they getting their intel from? And they have very good intel a lot of times, and they're getting it from people like you and me sometimes. And so we have to question ourselves sometimes as to what our own role might be in relation to crime and violence in our country. The other thing that stood out for me from this presentation is that the majority of our violent crimes, the majority of our homicides are being committed with guns. It is perhaps trite to say that we don't produce guns in the Caribbean. And I believe for far too long the United States has been given a pass. The US has become the main source of weapons, handguns in our region. And I believe that more needs to be said and more needs to be done by us as a Caribbean region to say to our brother and friend, the United States, that whatever your views may be on guns, and your right to carry guns, and your right to own guns, that your guns and the freedom that you express through owning and carrying is having an effect on our societies. Too many guns are making their way into our region, and I believe that law enforcement would agree that those weapons are largely, in large measure, coming from the United States of America. And so I'm happy that USAID is involved, because as USAID looks at our gang problem, USAID must also look at what the United States is doing to contribute to that problem that we're having. You know, there may have been gangs from time immemorial, but if all the gangs could do is throw stones and bottles, the homicide rate would be a lot lower. But the fact that the gangs have access to weapons and more high-powered weapons, it tells me, therefore, that we need also to look at some strategy that puts more pressure on the United States to control the flow of weapons into our region. You know, I have engaged with colleagues in the US, and they have spent an inordinate amount of money in our region in the war against drugs, for example, in trying to prevent drugs and trying to prevent illegal immigrants coming into the United States. And I've often said to them that you appear to be more interested in what's coming in and very uninterested or disinterested in what's going out. And I think that we need to see the same rigor. We need to see the same controls in terms of what's leaving the United States, because a lot of these weapons that we're getting are coming straight from the United States. So I think that we need that foreign policy initiative we need as a CARICOM region, because all of us across the Caribbean archipelago are suffering from the same problems. We definitely need to engage with the United States and put the ball back in their court in relation to their own contribution to this problem that we are experiencing. I am not saying that to deny the cogency or relevance of all the other factors that have been raised here. I think that all of those factors are important, and it tells me that we have a tremendous amount of work to do. I will make one last point, and that has to do with consistency. It is true that as a people we tend to react to the latest crisis. Over the years, whenever the homicide rate drops, and you've seen the graphs, we tend to go quiet. Things are good. Whether it's peace or whatever you want to call it, not many homicides. And people start to pat themselves on the backs and congratulate themselves that they're doing well. And then the following year, we see an upsurge where one homicide then triggers sometimes several others. The truth is that St. Kitts and Nevis has been here before. St. Kitts and Nevis has had consultations before. St. Kitts and Nevis has had reports and roadmaps that have been done before. But we have not been consistent in terms of our approach. We have not been consistent in following the recommendations, in engaging in the interventions. And I say that because I want the message to go very clearly to the Honorable Prime Minister and his team who are leading this effort, that we ought not to be gathered here and consulting again in 2024 in vain. It has to be that if we are going to be serious about tackling and confronting this problem once and for all, that whatever this leads to, whatever recommendations that come forward, that we once and for all decide that we will follow this path, and that we won't see a change in government that comes from time to time, and that change in government then abandons what we started, and then we wait until the problem gets again to a crisis level, and then we say, let us have some more consultation. I think it's important that whatever the lessons learned, whatever we can get from the report from USAID, whatever we can get from these consultations, that we implement and that we are consistent in our implementation of the solutions. I don't think that criminals are born. I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist, I may be wrong. I feel that people, in large measure, come out of a particular environment. I also feel that the best time and the most opportune time to get people in hand are when they're young. It's very hard when a man is already 20 or 21 set in his ways to say you're going to correct him at that point. But arguably, if you can get them at 5 and 6 and 8 and 9. So I am hopeful that as we build out this response, that we're going to see our schools involved, we're going to see our youth involved. I look across the audience here, and I don't see many people who can say they're young. Some may say so, but it may not be so. So we really need, I think, to see the youth engaged, because ultimately, this future that we're talking about is for them. And so they need to be engaged. We need to understand from their perspective what causes this 11-year-old that Mr. Sipasad, I think his name is, spoke about, to have such rage in him at that young age. And I would really like to see this consultation extended to our youth, because I believe that is where the intervention arguably may work best if we are to beat this problem and if we are to make a difference in our country. So I end by thanking all of you for being here. I thank Senator Iselin Phillip, who is co-chair of this effort, and the Prime Minister, who's not here today, but nevertheless, I'm sure he'll have a report on what happened here today, that the island of Nevis is committed to this undertaking. We're committed to consultation. We're committed to developing ideas. I look across this room. I see people with expertise that they can offer. I'm hopeful that those in authority will listen. And then once a plan is formulated, that plan will be implemented and that will be consistent. Crime, you see, is not a political issue. It is not a political issue because there's no politician out there who can solve crime. I like to remind people that when I look in my Bible, Cain killed Abel, and that was a long time ago. So we have had the tendency of man to do bad things from a very long time. And so crime must be seen by all of us as a social issue. And if it's a social issue, it means that it troubles all of us, it impacts all of us. And if that is the case, it means, therefore, that whatever plan is developed now must be a long-term strategy. It must be a long-term plan. It must be a plan that successive governments, however constituted, will say, let us implement, because we've had buy-in to this plan. And the reason I say that is because sometimes I travel and I go to countries, I've been to China, for example, Singapore, places like those, and they tell me they have a 50-year plan. I say, 50 years? Here we're lucky if we plan for 2 years. 50-year plan. What that tells you is that whoever comes, this is the direction that they hope that they will go in for this period of time. So my suggestion is that as we develop a plan, we get the buy-in from all the stakeholders, it becomes our national plan that can then be implemented and done so consistently, regardless of change of authority and commissioner of police and DPP and all of these things, but consistently applied so that we can get the results that our country needs. My desire, ladies and gentlemen, is to see no more bloodshed. When I look at the statistic that the average age of those dying in gang-related violence is 27, I think that's what I took away from that slide. You imagine a young man at 27, how much he could have offered to St. Kitts and Nevis in terms of our development. Think about yourself where you were at 27. Some of us at that age are still finding out who we are and where we want to go. And when we think of the hundreds, because that's the number now, of youngsters that we would have lost, we understand that we would have lost significantly in terms of our sustainable development. And so I wish this consultation well. I'm hopeful that people will be open and forthright with their views, and that we may be able to engage at all levels. I see members from the church, I see members from education, I see members from law enforcement. I want to recognize Dr. Glenn Griffin, Nevis, who I met yesterday and told me he has come back home, and I welcome home. So many who have a contribution to make. I also see the politicians. They're good, but they come and go. So the important people in the room are the ones who have the expertise, the churches, the ones who invested in this community. And I want to hear those views and opinions, and hopefully we can shape a model that can become a model for our region. St. Kitts and Nevis may be small, but we can do great things if we do it together. Thank you very much, and I wish the consultations every success.
Thank you, Honorable. Just a few words that stood out for me. Psychological trauma, direction, foundations, and the relevant groups. Who are we targeting? The direction, where are we heading? Where do we want to go? Foundation, we have to start putting things in place, because like I mentioned earlier on, what we all want is positive results. We need safer communities. We want our children to grow up in an environment where they can dwell, live, love, learn, laugh. So how do we get it done? All hands on deck. It's a whole of society approach. Thank you.